So welcome everyone to the last Metro Council webinar of 2021. We're so glad that all of you are able to be here today. So my name is Jamie Katz. I am chair of the InfoNet group, and then I have with me Kayla Schwartz as well, who is also on the InfoNet group, and we are the individuals that kind of do the work of Metro Council. Just a little bit about Metro Council so that you know so Metro Council stands for the Metropolitan Association of Community Mental Health Centers. And so we're also known as Metro Council. And so I think I said that right. So all of the behavioral health, community mental health centers in the Metro, we all collaborate together on webinars as well as other educational opportunities such as the Mental Health KC conference that we will be having in May. And so if you would like to know more information about us, you can go to our website, mentalhealthkc.org, and learn about other opportunities as well. And so I'm really excited though, because I get to introduce Dr. Ryan Cox. Dr. Cox has presented at our conference before, but we're really excited to have him present on implicit bias today. So a little background, just so you kind of know a bit about him. So Dr. Cox serves as the program manager of the Infectious Disease Clinic and the program manager and behavioral health director of the LGBTQ specialty clinic at now University Health. He earned his PhD from the University of Memphis and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in LGBT interdisciplinary care with an emphasis on transgender health and HIV at the VA Medical Center in Houston, Texas. And he is an assistant professor at the UMKC School of Medicine and teaches his own LGBT health course at Kansas City University School of Medicine and Biosciences in a psychology doctorate program. Dr. Cox was previously the executive board president of Thrive Health Connection and now serves as the Kansas City representative on the Vivint Health National Board. And so thank you so much for being here, Dr. Cox. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Here, I'll let you run this presentation and we'll be monitoring the chat. And thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks for having me. Much like, a lot of other people, I think Zoom is not my sort of preferred platform for doing presentations, but this is where we are. So I like to try to make these interactive. So if you're going to be monitoring the chat, at any point, if people have questions, if people have comments, if they want to just kind of interrupt anything that I'm saying, and I'm happy to kind of engage with any issues or questions or anything that people have going on. So I am today going to be talking about implicit bias. And I'm going to be going into some definitions about what exactly that means as we get a little bit further on into the presentation. But I'm going to start with some objectives. Before I get to the objectives, one thing I would like to say is talking about implicit versus explicit bias and attitudes is a very complex subject. It's very abstract in many ways. It's very multi-layered. It's very, it's complex. So today we're really just going to be kind of scratching the surface with some of these things, really just kind of going through some definitions, looking at what does it really mean to have implicit bias? What does it mean to be able to start changing behavioral patterns in response to those biases and that sort of thing. So I'm not here today to tell you how to reduce your implicit bias, as I will talk about later in the presentation. There's not really any evidence that we even can reduce our implicit bias, but what we can do is respond, become more aware of it, and respond differently to it. So I'm just going to be talking about the role of bias, how it functions, how to start recognizing it a little bit better, and then how to maybe respond to it in a different way. But I'm not here to tell you today, this is how you reduce your bias. And again, we're really just going to be kind of scratching the surface of this subject. So some of the objectives today are just understanding the meaning of implicit bias and implicit attitudes, differentiating between implicit and explicit, articulating the ways in which implicit bias maybe impacts our decision-making or our behaviors, and then explaining some methods to kind of just help reduce the impact of implicit bias. And notice I said reducing the impact of bias, not necessarily reducing bias itself, because I do think that's a really important distinction to make. So before we do that, I'm not going to have you write this on a sheet of paper because we're not in a classroom, but I want you to just take a moment, and I'm going to give you a moment to just think about 6 to 10 people in your life, maybe if you don't have that many, the first few names and faces that pop up of people that you trust the most in your life that are not members of your family. So friends, coworkers, community members, whatever the case may be. And just take a moment to just think about the first people that pop up in your head. And I imagine for many of you, probably there were some automatic people that immediately came into your mind that were probably your family came first, maybe your spouse, siblings, maybe parents, maybe not for some of you, but those are probably the people that popped up first. And then if you go a little further for people who aren't in your family, maybe your best friend, childhood friends, church members, whatever the case may be. But I'm guessing, and there are, of course, exceptions to this for everyone, but by and large, the people that you thought of that you trust the most probably tended to largely be people who shared many of your same traits and characteristics. So probably people who are the same racial and ethnic background as you, people who probably have mostly the same levels of educational attainment that you have, probably people who are around the same social economic status as you are. Because those are the people that you probably have the most interaction with, right? So we tend to extend greater trust in our lives. We tend to extend more positive regard, more empathy, and more cooperation toward people who are in our in-group. And people who are in our in-group are people who tend to be more like us on various demographic sort of markers or variables. We all typically have a preference for people who are more like ourselves in various ways. This is largely instinctual, and this is a very unconscious process that most of us have. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I want to stress that this is largely instinctual, it's largely unconscious, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with it. What I do want to stress is that this can have implications for how we function in the world. And that's what I really want to talk about today. So if you think about, if people tend to extend greater trust, greater cooperation, and more empathy toward people who are members of their in-group, however you define that in-group, what kind of implications does that have, for instance, maybe a workplace? What kind of implications does that have for educational environments? If you're a person who's in charge maybe of hiring or firing or promoting, or if you're a person who's in charge of evaluating or supervising, statistically speaking, you are more likely to offer opportunities and give higher evaluations to people who are more like you. It is what it is, and this is what we're here to talk about today. And I know that that can be a fairly controversial statement, but I'm going by what sort of the science and the research says about these things. So before we start talking about that any further, let's talk about kind of some definitions and what we mean when we talk about explicit, implicit, and when we talk about bias and attitudes. So when we talk about an attitude, what we're really talking about is an evaluative disposition. An attitude is a tendency to like or dislike or act favorably or unfavorably towards something or something. This attitude can be explicit or it can be implicit. So an example of explicit can be a tendency to favor chocolate ice cream over vanilla ice cream. That may be something that you like. You may be more inclined, I was going to use a sports metaphor, but as I was creating it in my head, I realized I don't actually know anything about sports. I was going to say you may be someone who, prefers Chiefs fans over, and I couldn't think of any other football team, Dallas Cowboys fans. So I'm revealing a little bit about myself here. My bias is towards people who don't like sports. I'm just kidding. But that can kind of be an example of a more explicit bias. A more implicit attitude would be something that we are not quite as aware of. And so throughout this presentation, I will use some examples kind of repetitively to kind of demonstrate the difference between an explicit or an implicit attitude. So if you think about voting, for instance, political attitudes can be very explicit and they can also be very implicit. So an explicit version of a voting attitude might be you go to vote for a candidate because you have really listened to everything both candidates have to say. You've really evaluated both positions. You really think candidate A has the better stance, has a more powerful position, and just would be more effective at their job. So you go with candidate A. An example of an implicit voting decision might be you don't really know a whole lot about either candidate, but maybe you know the candidate's sister, and you really like the candidate's sister. So you tend to, and this is an unconscious process, but you tend to transpose the positive characteristics of the candidate's sister onto the candidate. So you might say, well, I don't really know either one of these people, but I do know candidate B's sister, and I like her, so he probably can't be too bad. So I'll vote for candidate B. That might be an example of a more implicit decision that you're making. And you may not even really understand or be conscious that you're making that decision. Another example can kind of be conservative or Democratic, or conservative or liberal, I should say. Republican or Democrat, conservative, liberal, and there's a broad spectrum of those things. I understand that. But that can be very explicit or that can be very implicit as well. And so there's a lot of research, for instance, that looks at people's voting preferences in terms of conservative or liberal, and often finds that people will maybe identify with one party over another for various reasons, because that's how they were raised, because they live in a more conservative or liberal environment, because they met someone once who shared that political affiliation and they have good or bad feelings about that person. So people tend to align more with one political party or another, and then often retroactively moderate their positions to be more in line with that party, as opposed to thinking out their feelings about various positions and then aligning those with a party. People tend to kind of do that backwards. And so that would be an example of a more implicit toward bias towards a political party or towards political positions. This is where I would normally ask, does that make sense? But I don't actually have access to any of you. So hopefully that clarifies things. And again, as we go on, I'll be digging into these things a little bit deeper. So an explicit attitude is just defined as being within our conscious awareness. An explicit attitude is something that we are aware of. This can be expressed overtly and deliberately. Yeah, I prefer chocolate over vanilla. That's an explicit attitude. We can understand that, we can explain it, and we can reason through it. That would be an example of what we consider an explicit attitude. An implicit attitude tends to be something that is more unconscious, something that we have a little bit maybe less awareness that we are responding to. And so I'll dive into these three sort of subpoints under unconscious, but I want to address the sort of bigger points first. So when we're talking about something implicit, it tends to be more unconscious. It tends to be very rapid decision-making. It is not something we really think about. It tends to be very emotional and very automatic in the moment. And that's one reason why we're often very unaware of these implicit attitudes, is because they happen so quickly that we're not even aware that we're making a decision. These implicit attitudes tend to be generated through more long-term exposure. They're stored in long-term memory, and we tend to process approximately 95% of the information that we come in contact with unconsciously. So we are exposed to something like 11 million data points a minute or something in our daily lives, and there's absolutely no way we can consciously sift through all of those things. So a lot of things have to be sort of implicit, they have to be automatic, and they have to be things that we don't really think about because we just don't have the time or the emotional or cognitive bandwidth to think about every single decision we make. The other thing that we know about implicit attitudes is they tend to be very stable over time. And they can pretty reliably predict related judgments and behaviors. So they can predict things like our consumer preferences. They can predict things like our voting patterns or political attitudes. They can often predict who we're going to be friends with, what kind of neighborhoods we're going to live in. A lot of these things are very, very implicitly determined by us without even having a lot of conscious awareness about them. So kind of going back to that first bullet point of implicit attitudes being inherently unconscious. And then we have sort of, if we're determining if something is unconscious, we have to have sort of three versions of awareness about it. So research kind of says we have something kind of that we call a source awareness, which means we can be aware of the origin of a particular attitude. We can have a content awareness, which is the awareness of the attitude itself, or we can have an impact awareness, which is the influence this particular attitude may have on other psychological processes. So when we're talking about unconsciousness, we also have to think about what is conscious awareness and what is driving decisions we are currently making. And I know this is kind of an abstract concept, and this gets kind of into the weeds a little bit, and I don't want to get too into the weeds here. Although I find this stuff really interesting, we could probably kind of talk about it all day. We have a pretty limited amount of time here. So we have to determine when we are talking about something being in our conscious awareness, are we talking about source awareness, which again is awareness of an attitude? Are we talking about content? Are we aware of the attitude itself? Or are we aware of the impact that this attitude will have on other psychological mechanisms? So I just want to kind of throw those things out there, but what I really want you to take away from this is what is comprised of an implicit attitude: unconsciousness, rapidity, and generated through long-term exposure and stored in our long-term memory. And the idea that these are largely stable over time. So how are our attitudes shaped? And I'm talking about explicit and implicit attitudes here. Well, largely they're shaped by the environments in which we grow up. So they're shaped by family and friends. Most of us, even if we maybe move away from our families, if we have very different lifestyles than maybe people in our family live, we are still very, very steeped within the attitudes with which we grow up. And most of us continue to kind of adopt those attitudes. You know, you may hear people as they get older, I know I've said it a lot, oh my God, the older I get and the more I turn into my mother. You know, the more I find that I am more and more like my mom. I say the things my mom says, I have the same sort of attitudes that my mom has. And I may express those things very differently, but I've been very shaped by the way in which I grew up with both of my parents. But my mom has a very big personality, and I was very shaped by that. I was very shaped by our friends, you know, and a lot of people can look at siblings, for instance, that are all very different, and they can say, well, all those siblings grew up in the same family. How could they have all turned out so differently? Well, yeah, they grew up in the same family, and they probably all have pretty core similar values. But most of them probably had different friend groups. They had different exposures to things as children and adolescents. So they may have had different explicit attitudes shaped by different kinds of influences than maybe their siblings did. So other ways attitudes are shaped for us are by media portrayals and cultural representations of groups. And this is very, very, very common. And there are some really profound examples I'm going to talk about a little bit later on the way media can really influence the way people outwardly think about situations and maybe social issues and things that happen in our culture. And I just like to think about our attitudes are shaped by our culture and they're shaped by our environment. And it's like the ocean we swim in or the air we breathe. We can't necessarily see it. We don't necessarily feel it. We're generally not often aware of it, but it is always there and it is always influencing us. And it is impossible to grow up in a culture and not internalize at least some of its values and some of its messages. And so when we talk about a lot of racial bias, for instance, in our culture, what we're really talking about are those attitudes and maybe belief systems that we've internalized from our culture, from media, from politics, that we might not overtly express belief in, but we may instinctively react to in some way anyway. And I would say in our culture right now, we are having such a reckoning with this kind of historical racism. But I would also say that a lot of what we call racism, I don't think necessarily stems from intentional prejudice, but a lot of what we call racism, I would really refer to as racial bias. And you can argue whether or not racial bias is defined the same way as racism is. And nevertheless, the impact may be exactly the same. But what we're often really talking about is a bias. And in some ways, that can be just as damaging because so many people are unaware of the biases that they have. And a really great example of that may be, you may be a person who advocates for social justice, who would never think of yourself as being racist. But if you're alone at night walking down a sidewalk and a person of a different racial background from you is walking towards you, your heart rate might speed up a little bit, or you might pull your purse a little bit closer to you. And you may not even be aware that you're doing that. You may walk a little faster, and you may not even be aware that you're doing that, but your body is aware of that, and your vigilance and your guard tends to go up. Your heart rate tends to go up. You know, you may start scanning your environment a little more closely than you were before. And this is what we call a biased response. So you may consciously not even be aware that you're doing those things, or you may be consciously aware that you're doing them, but say, why am I doing that? Why am I afraid? I have no racial, animosity at all. And this is really what we're talking about when we're talking about the difference between explicit and implicit bias. And these are the ways in which it tends to kind of manifest in our everyday sort of activities and interactions with other people, which is why bias can be so insidious to our culture, and why it's that much more important that we learn how to identify that bias and learn to address it a little bit more proactively. So I know we've probably all seen the kind of Freudian iceberg of, the id and the ego and the conscious and the unconscious and all that kind of stuff. So the conscious part is, the iceberg that's above the water, what we're all very aware of. And I would say in this particular instance, what's visible above our water really is just our behaviors. And that's all that we can really express to people. People see our behaviors, people are witness to our behaviors. And so that's what's visible. But underneath that water, there may be a much larger iceberg base that's not visible. And that can be our perceptions, it can be our attitudes, whether they're explicit or implicit. It can be our values, and it can be our belief systems that are really impacting our behaviors and how we respond to all of these other things. And I just want to check in if anybody's putting anything in chat. I don't know if I will see if anything pops up in the chat or not. But again, as we're going along, if people have questions, if people have feedback, feel free to throw some things up there, and we can try to address those in a moment. So what really is implicit bias? It's also known as an implicit attitude. It can look like stereotypes, so believing that all members of a particular subgroup all have similar characteristics or tend to act the same. I think we all kind of engage in stereotypical behavior to some degree, and I guess what I mean by that is we all have stereotypical beliefs, I guess I should say, to some degree, and we all know that they're, even if we may hold stereotyped beliefs, we may say, well, I know that not everyone acts that way, but by and large, this particular group of people tends to have these kinds of characteristics. And it doesn't always have to be bad, it can be good. So when you think about things like the model minority, so there's this kind of belief system that gets propagated a lot that people who come from Asian cultures tend to be very studious. They tend to be very good at math and engineering. But that is a stereotype, and it's a pretty gross stereotype. But it's also what we would kind of consider a positive stereotype. So it's not something that most people would look at and think of as being a bad thing. I identify as a gay man, and so we experience all kinds of stereotypes, some of them positive, some of them negative. But even the positive stereotypes, I frankly find kind of offensive, and some of them may be, oh, gay men are more fun, or they really know how to decorate, or, they're really snappy dressers. Sure, maybe some of us are, but there's also a lot of non-gay men who are good at interior decorating and good dressers. So these are all just kind of stereotypes and things that a lot of people tend to, even if they don't really outwardly believe them, still often respond to some of these things in ways as if they might be true. Implicit bias is looking for patterns and generalizations about people or about groups of people. As human beings, we can only process consciously so much information at a time, and it's not very much. We can only really consciously process about 5% of the stimuli that we are confronted with every day. And so as humans, we have to categorize and generalize things and people. We just have to. Nobody has the emotional or cognitive bandwidth to think about or individually assess every piece of information that we get. So as human beings, we have to adapt, we have to put things in patterns, and we have to generalize. So we generalize about gender, we generalize about race, we generalize about young people versus older people, about various generations. We generalize about people who have this job versus that job, people who live in the suburbs versus the inner city, Republicans and Democrats. Like, these are just things that we do. But if you were to go and ask somebody, what are the characteristics of a person who lives in the suburbs? You might throw some things out, but you also might think of 10 people off the top of your head that don't really fit those characteristics. So when it comes down to individual people, we're a lot better at sussing out those individual differences and sort of adjusting to defied stereotypes than we are when we're talking about generalized groups of people. This is just kind of what I said before. We make mental associations based on demographic material and social categories. So, but what the danger of that, of course, it's a very natural thing to do. It's a very instinctual thing to do. But of course, again, the danger of that is that this may lead to discrimination without having conscious intent to discriminate. I'll address that bullet point, the mental associations, here in a minute in a little more depth. And this is kind of getting to the point I made before as well. These are not necessarily stable individual attitudes. They predict disparities more at an aggregate level. So when we were talking about negative manifestations of some of these things, they tend to manifest more at a group level as opposed to an individual level. And the way that I guess I would describe that is you can always find exceptions to all of these things. Every generalization, stereotype, or pattern you can always find individual exceptions to those things, but you will still often be able to apply them at a group or an aggregate level. And these are things, again, we just instinctually do as human beings. So some of the ways this kind of manifests, kind of revisiting this stereotype again, most members of a group having similar characteristics. That's just what a stereotype is. Prejudice, I would say, is more of a belief system that you have rather than an attitude. And so prejudice is a perceived opinion or belief. And again, this can be something that's both positive. It can be positive or it can be a negative prejudice. And then that can lead to the behavior, which is often discrimination, or the flip side of that might be a preference for someone who maybe hasn't really earned that hiring or that promotion or whatever. Or maybe just it comes down to who you sort of give your energy to in your friendships. And you may have a preference for people who tend to be a little bit more like you in your relationships. So these are some of the ways that these kind of implicit attitudes can tend to manifest a little bit. And so when we take this and we sort of associate it with more of an emotional model, what we're really looking at is an implicit attitude is more likely to involve spontaneous behavior and spontaneous judgments. So in that way, an implicit attitude is more likely to activate our amygdala, which is the first part of our brain that develops, what we call our emotional, or sometimes referred to quote unquote as the lizard brain. So this is the very first part of our brain that develops. Is the part of our brain that's responsible for our emotional responses. It is the part of our brain that's responsible for making snap judgments, for fight or flight. It is it is not a part of our brain that we think about or can control actively. Explicit attitudes may be more associated with our prefrontal cortex, which, if you know about neuroscience, is the very last part of our brain that develops. It's the part of our brain that's responsible for reasonable decision making. It's the part of our brain that's responsible for categorizing things. It's responsible for organizing, for being able to conceptualize abstract reasoning. This is the part of our brain that doesn't really develop until we're in our mid-20s. Really about 25, 26 is when this part of our brain is complete. This is why teenagers, you can say, oh my God, you're so academically intelligent. Why do you do such stupid things? Well, it's because teenagers' prefrontal cortexes aren't yet fully developed. So they don't really have the ability for a lot of abstract thought. They can be very compassionate, they can be very empathic, they can be very smart, but teenagers just don't have the ability for a lot of future-oriented, abstract, kind of consequential type thought, which is why teenagers end up doing a lot of kind of dumb things. So again, kind of recapping that, our implicit attitudes tend to be more like our amygdala, which is the first part of our brain that develops, very emotional, very reactive. Our explicit attitudes tend to be much more associated with our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that develops last and is responsible for kind of responsible decision making. So if we want to start limiting or mediating the amount of maybe discrimination, prejudice, or damage we do with the responses to our implicit attitudes, how do we start to engage that awareness? So what we know through research is that correlations between implicit and explicit attitudes are often low. So what that means is we're often not even aware of the way that our implicit attitudes or beliefs are affecting our explicit attitudes or beliefs, or how we are reacting. Oftentimes this is, again, it's extremely unconscious, and we're not even really aware of how it's happening. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with the doll test. And this was something that was done back when the Supreme Court was deciding on Brown versus Board of Education. And the doll test was actually something that helped push the court in the direction of desegregation. Excuse me. That actually helped push the court into the area of desegregation. And so what this doll test was, is they took white kids and they took black kids, and they asked them to pick which dolls they liked the best and which ones were more attractive. Well, by and large, all of the kids, including the white kids and the black kids, tended to choose the white dolls over the black dolls. So they had a bunch of white dolls and they had a bunch of black dolls. They, in all other respects, were identical, except for the color of the sort of plastic that was supposed to represent their skin. But all of the kids showed a preference for the white dolls over the black dolls. And so this was actually something that the Supreme Court took into evidence to show that educational segregation was having a deleterious effect on Black kids' overall mental health and sense of positive regard. So those little kids weren't consciously thinking about, how am I going to beat this study? The kids didn't really know what they were doing. They were just hanging out with teachers at their school and asked to pick the doll that they liked better. And they all just kind of happened to pick the white doll. So this was a pretty landmark study to kind of show the effects, the negative effects of discrimination, and that separate did not necessarily equal. Some other ways that we have kind of, that are used quite frequently to determine these are the implicit association test and the affective misattribution procedure test. So I don't really know a lot of the details or ins and outs of these tests, but these are tests that are generally used to measure our own kind of implicit biases and attitudes that we may hold as individuals. The thing about these tests is the findings don't typically tend to be stable, and the test-retest validity seems to be kind of low. So there's not a lot of evidence that these are super effective at measuring our levels of bias, but they are still used pretty commonly. And there has been some research that has kind of suggested that becoming more aware of bias or doing kind of anti-bias training can have a really short-term impact on these kinds of tests, but it's not an impact that has a lasting effect. So that's one reason the test and retest validity is low. So what I mean by that is somebody might go through an anti-bias training, and it may be effective for them for a day or two, but the effect tends to wear off pretty quickly as people tend to kind of revert back to their baseline and their mean, which again, as humans, is something we tend to kind of instinctually do. So that's one reason why we're not super aware of how effective these tests can be. Someone put in the chat, Harvard has online tests that measure all sorts of biases. Yeah, so the IAT, the implicit associative, the implicit association test, I believe, is one of those tests. So I think it would kind of fall into this category of it can be kind of manipulated for in the short term, but not tend to last long term. So another way we can kind of talk about the way we internalize our bias is through what we call the bias of crowds model. And so we've all heard this, the wisdom of the crowd, right? So getting caught up in the crowd, the mob mentality. That's exactly what this is. And we are all predisposed to mob mentality. We may think that we're different and that we're not predisposed to that, but everyone is. It's purely human nature. We have evolved as humans to belong. We have evolved as humans to live socially. We have evolved as humans generally to get along with other humans and other people for the sake of self-preservation. And so the sort of mob mentality is something that we're all kind of subject to. And I'm not saying when people, when you're in a violent situation, and the mob mentality, I think gets sort of expressed most oftenly in movies and literature as people go crazy and, take out vengeance on the wrong person or whatever, misdirect their anger. That can certainly happen. But I think for most of us, this tends to be a much more subtle kind of effect. And so the model of this bias of crowds model tends to suggest that our individual bias is shaped by our environment and by our social structures. I can just say that as a kid, when I was growing up, I grew up in a fairly rural part of Arkansas in the 1980s that was not diverse really in any way. It was very Christian, very white, very middle class, very conservative. And there just was not a lot of deviation from that. I don't think I met a Black person in my life until I was somewhere in my mid-20s and living in more urban areas. And I have to know that shaped me as an individual, and the way that I was exposed or not exposed to different kinds of people and people who live different kinds of life than I did. I remember the first time I met a kid who said their family didn't go to church. I was like in junior high, and I was like, what? Like, every family goes to church. What do you mean your family doesn't go to church? And that was like really shocking for me. And so there's no way for me to say that didn't impact ultimately kind of my long-term sort of perception of how people lived. And so another way to kind of talk about this is our individual bias is largely transient and it's sort of dependent upon shared experiences. So cultural stereotypes, media experiences. And so the way that I tend to kind of explain this is through the weather and climate analogy. So weather patterns are sort of acute instances that happen in the very short term. Climate is a more long-term model of how things exist. So we may we may kind of to put this in a more personal experience. How can I sort of verbalize this in a way that our individual bias tends to be very impacted by, again, kind of the structures in which we live. And there may be individual exceptions to that. There may be ways that those stereotypes or those biases are defied that we come into contact with, but it doesn't mean that the rule doesn't generally hold for us in terms of how we think about these things. So even though there may be exceptions, it doesn't necessarily disprove the rule for us, if that makes sense. And this is affected by all kinds of things like housing segregation, crime, again, urban versus rural versus suburban kind of environments. One of the things, if you'll see my second bullet point on here, slave study, one of the things that I read about that I found really, really fascinating was there was a study done in 2014 that looked at 1,400 slave-holding counties in the United States, mostly in the South. And this was based on census from 1860 that they went back and looked at. What they found were in those counties that had once been slaveholding counties, 150 years later, there tended to be more measurable structural inequalities in those counties, and the people who lived in those counties tended to display more implicit bias in sort of testing and questioning, and through things like how they measure kind of skin conducting kind of experiments where your body will react in physiological ways that you're not kind of consciously aware of. So these are another way to kind of measure bias. And so what they found were in these counties that had been slave counties, people there tended to have measurably and tangibly higher levels of bias than people who lived in counties that were not slave counties, even 150 years later. So these are some of the ways that these structural and systemic kinds of cultures that we all live in can impact how we think and how we feel about some of these things. Police shootings are another one. When they study patterns of police shootings, there's a lot of variability across these counties, but there tend to be more shootings in larger metro areas that have lower median incomes, but higher inequality. So counties that tend to basically have more income inequality tend to have higher levels of fatal police shootings than counties that have lower levels of economic inequality. So I think these are the kind of things that I think are very, very interesting. That last one, crack versus opioid, I think this is a really excellent example of how the media can kind of impact how we think about these things. So if you think about the opioid epidemic and how that is sort of perceived in our media and in our political and social structures, people talk about opioid epidemic as a result of economic disparities, economic anxiety, the hollowing of the middle class. It largely affects white rural areas. This is where you see the most opioid epidemics. This is where you see the most overdoses of opioids, places that have had a lot of deindustrialization, places that have had a lot of job flight, places that have high levels of unemployment, low levels of resources. And there has been an enormous social and political response to that. Job training, social welfare kind of programs, re-education programs have been heaped upon a lot of these areas that have had these opioid epidemics. I'm very supportive of that. I'm not being critical. But when you look at the crack epidemic of the 1980s and who it tended to impact, you saw a very different response. And even though the effects or the causes of the opioid epidemic and the crack epidemic were exactly the same, so loss of employment, economic disenfranchisement, deindustrialization, loss of jobs, economic disinvestment, the exact same situations led to crack and led to opioids. But the crack epidemic tended to impact Black, inner city, urban individuals. So therefore, those people were maligned as morally lesser than a politics, or sorry, a culture of violence, a culture of laziness. They were blamed for their crack addictions. There was no major sort of government programs to help a lot of those people. So you kind of see how the approach to these were very, very different based on who they impacted, even though the cause of both of these things was exactly the same. And the results are often exactly the same, but because of who it impacts, black inner city versus white rural folks, you see a very, very different response in our society and in our politics. And that, again, is a result of bias. And I'm noticing the time. We don't have a whole lot of time left. So I do want to kind of, and I even practiced this earlier today, but I tend to talk a lot. So I am kind of rush through some of these things. So when we talk about a macro level prejudice, these are prejudices that tend to be more structural. So systemic inequalities. So things like not having hospitals or medical systems within lower income communities. So having Black neighborhoods cut off by highways from resources within the city, or environmental racism, these kinds of things is what we're talking about when we talk about a more macro level or structural prejudice. And so what we're talking about there is social capital. So social capital is our interconnectedness between people within a particular environment. So these can be people within the same city, within the same neighborhood, within the same church, within the same workplace. But generally it's people who kind of share a geographic kind of identity. Inward social capital are people who share a social identity. So that tends to get a little bit more granular, people who live in the same neighborhoods, same friends, same kind of social structures. So bridging that social capital means respectful and mutual relationships between networks within the same environment who differ on social identity. So less structural prejudice means you have a greater bridging of social capital. So you have more interaction with people who differ on social identities within environments. And then linking social capital are relationships of trust and mutual respect across people at different levels of the social hierarchy. Social and community prejudice tends to impede these networks and tends to reduce crossover between these networks, and tends to be able to reduce people being able to kind of change their economic stations or status. So prejudice tends to be sort of conceptualized as a product of individual level processes that occur in actions between individuals. So when we talk about prejudice, we generally tend to talk about individual feelings, beliefs, and behaviors. But we also, what we don't really talk about as much are these kind of impoverished or prejudiced kind of social networks across social groups that tend to erode or exist less when you have more structural prejudice. So the more structural prejudice you have, the more individual prejudice you're also typically going to have, because there's less crossover between groups. So an example of this might be something like people who benefited from the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, but they may have been opposed to it because it was conceived of by a Black, what people considered liberal president. So people tend to have more implicit biases toward a government act that benefited them because they may have had more internal prejudice against the president at the time. And you see this across all kinds of political and social programs. If you break down the elements of the programs, people will often have very, very different responses of whether they like something or don't than if you relate it to a particular politician or president who maybe created the program or champions that program. So if we're getting to the point where we're starting to understand this prejudice and that it tends to be very structural, and that there's not a lot we can do as individuals to improve our implicit bias. So what does help? If we're kind of drowning in that water of a prejudice culture and we feel like we're kind of being prey to that, so what does help people reduce their implicit bias or change their implicit bias, because implicit bias can be good as well. First, let's talk about what doesn't help. So even barring this presentation today, implicit bias training doesn't really work. There is zero scientific evidence that implicit bias training has any kind of efficacy at actually reducing people's implicit bias, partly because people are so unaware of the implicit bias that they have. So how are you supposed to actively and consciously change something if you're not even really aware that it exists in the first place? So there is a very large industry around implicit bias trainings, and I don't doubt that most of those people are very, very well-meaning, but there is virtually zero scientific efficacy for implicit bias trainings actually working and reducing implicit bias. And you hear about this a lot within police departments. So when police officers often like shoot people, they'll say, oh, I was scared. You know, I had this immediate reaction to protect myself. So a lot of people put that down to having a lot of implicit bias. So they come in and they say, well, we need to teach these police officers to have less implicit bias so that they don't respond in these ways. So a lot of money and time and energy is spent doing these implicit bias trainings. But again, there's very little efficacy or evidence that they work. A colorblind racial ideology is often something that people champion. And this gets kind of mocked in culture now, but this is something people still say, that they emphasize racial sameness, they emphasize equality of opportunity, that they don't really base anything on color, they don't see color, that doesn't play into any kind of effects for them. But what we know about that is that actually tends to increase implicit bias because that then gives you sort of a platform to blame any sort of bias you may have on the individual themselves. So if you can say, well, I don't really see color, I treat everyone exactly the same, you can say, well, it just so happens that, you know, white Sally over here was better at her job than, you know, someone over here. And so that may be a different race or ethnicity. So what colorblind racial ideology tends to do is actually just reinforce implicit biases. What also doesn't help is offering one counteracting example. So saying, well, because we had a Black president now, there is no more structural racism in our country, which most of us, I think, can probably agree that that's not accurate. So one counteracting example, one exception to the rule also doesn't tend to reduce implicit bias. And check out these chats real quick. Okay, perfect. Making sure there's nothing I needed to pay attention to. Okay, so what does help moving forward? So becoming aware of your own biases could produce responses that help to correct behaviors. And again, this is often not something that we're even aware of. So it's hard to become aware of our implicit biases. It's hard to change it if it's challenging to become aware of it. So there are some things we know that can help. So trying to become aware of our conscious biases and how our conscious biases may be impacting decisions that we are making and how they may be impacting other people. So that is one way we can really start to address our own sense of bias. One of the ways we can do that is to increase our interaction with people who are very different from us. So often when we are a person who is used to being in the majority population, and then we go someplace maybe where we're in the minority, we will often feel very uncomfortable. And again, that's sort of human nature and that's normal. But a lot of that is because we are around people that look different from us, and we tend to have a bias towards people who are like us. And so we tend to feel more comfortable in those environments. So one of the ways to kind of help become more aware of your bias is to increase your exposure to things that are foreign to you or novel to you, or things that you're not typically aware of. So what we call expanding your horizons, doing things that scare you, doing things that make you nervous. And this doesn't have to do with people always necessarily. It can be around people that it can look like being around people who are different from you, but it can also just maybe look like going to a cultural festival that you might not normally go to, going to a movie that you might not normally be interested in, or going to some kind of art production. You know, it can look like exposing yourself to all kinds of different things. Travel, you know, they say is often a way to reduce prejudice by exposing yourself to different cultures, eating foods that you're unfamiliar with, these kinds of things. And it sounds really simplistic, but there is evidence that engaging in behaviors that are novel to you can actually help reduce your implicit bias and make you more comfortable in situations that are unfamiliar to you in some way. Social movements actually have shown, there is some evidence that social movements tend to reduce bias. Last summer of 2020, when we were having enormous Black Lives Matter protests, for the first time since they originated in 2014, you started seeing a plurality of Americans in polling saying they supported the Black Lives Matter movement and they had a better understanding of the ways that systemic racism affected people. And again, a lot of that was because of George Floyd and the protests that kind of followed from that. And I think they were so hard to avoid that it finally started getting people's attention, and people started to better understand, I think, the systemic structures that Black people, I should say white people, started to better understand the systemic structures that Black people have always lived under in this country, and started to get a little bit of a better idea of our cultural sort of prejudice and bias that existed. And so again, for the first time last year, you did see more than 50% of Americans saying they better understood systemic racism and supported the Black Lives Matter movement. The gay and lesbian and now transgender rights movements are another one. You've seen enormous progress in not only the acceptance, but the acculturation of gays and lesbians into more mainstream cultures and into more traditional kind of family structures. And that is because so many gay people started coming out in the 80s and 90s, and people started becoming aware of how many people they actually knew who had these identities, and it started to break down that fear and break down those biases. And so it became much more accepted and much more common to work with a gay person, to have a gay person in your family, to have a gay friend. And I think something like 80% of Americans now say that they have a gay family member or a gay friend. And this is one reason why the gay rights movement has been, and there's still some work to do, but by and large has been one of the most successful social rights movements in really world history in terms of from where we started to where we got to in the shortest amount of time. The Me Too movement that kind of sprang up in 2017 has had enormous impact on people's awareness about gender bias, about sexual harassment and assault, and the ways that men and women tend to interact with each other in public and in these kind of structured work and education environments. And so that has also been ultimately a very successful social movement in helping raise awareness and provide education for maybe the ways that we behave that we always thought were sort of normal and accepted actually are having deleterious outcomes and impacts on people that we interact with. And beyond that, I think just kind of gaining a better self-awareness of what you tend to be drawn to, I think, what you tend to really feel comfortable around. And what I always say, and when I work with my students and people that I'm working with, no emotional response is invalid. Any emotional response that you have to anything is a valid response, but every emotional response is worthy of also being examined and processed before you react to that response in a behavioral way. And so I think that's also a good way to start becoming better aware of your biases and your own prejudice, is really looking at where do you get emotional response? What makes you feel emotional? What makes you feel angry? What makes you feel sad? What makes you feel hopeless? And what makes you feel joyful and comfortable and safe? And really start examining those outward manifestations to better understand all of your implicit biases, whether they are positive or negative. And it's 4:29, so I don't know if we have time or room for any kind of questions. This is my kind of reference page if anyone is interested. And like I said, I know that was really quick, really just kind of scratching the surface on some of the stuff, but I'm open to questions, comments, feedback at this point.
Yeah,
If
and
there's
I
time.
know we're at time, but I know that this is such an incredibly important topic. So anybody that has any questions, you can definitely ask it in the Q&A or the chat.
Someone
I do
did put in
know.
there, awareness is key. Is it continual over lifespans? And I would say, I hope so. I hope that we continue to grow and become more aware of ourselves. I think as human beings, our job in this life is to self-actualize as much as possible. And I think part of that self-actualization is better understanding what motivates us at an implicit level and really becoming more aware of those things and working as much as we can to decrease the effects of those. So I would hope over a lifespan. Yes. Yeah.
So we do have somebody that's asking how to reach out to you.
Okay. I will send a chat to everyone if you want to. I'll put my email in here. So I work at University Health. I'm a psychologist there at University Health. So my email is just ryan.cox@uhkc.org. You can find me on their website as well. I'm always happy to chat. Anything else before we wrap up?
That was the only question that we had right now.
Okay.
And no open questions. So I know that we are at time, but just want to thank Dr. Cox so very much for this presentation. I know this definitely opened my eyes a bit, and we hear, I think, a lot about implicit bias, but never really know what it actually means. Let's see. Katrina, I think, is asking about .com versus .org.
Oh, it is .org. Sorry if I said .com. That was a mistake. Yeah, it's .org.
Okay. And then the Metro Council website is mentalhealthkc.org as well. So there we go. So I just want to thank you all so much for joining today. Again, this was hosted by Metro Council. We will be starting up our 2022 webinars in January. We will not be having another one in December because the fourth Thursday, we figure most people will be gone. So we want to thank you all so much for joining today. If it's okay with you, Dr. Cox, we'll stick around for a couple more minutes in case people have questions. Yes, it is being recorded and it will be available on the Mental Health KC, mentalhealthkc.org website. We do not charge anything for anyone for these presentations, for these webinars. We just really want to get the information out to our community in the Kansas City Metro. Asking if it will be sent to us. We typically do not send it to anyone. We just have it more available on the website if individuals want to have access to it. But if that's something that you're really looking for, you can always let us know. Oh, the website is mentalhealthkc.org. And I'll put it in the chat as well. So thank you all so much for attending today. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for everyone's engagement.
Yeah, Caitlin, yes, it will be available on the website. It'll probably be early next week. Caitlin was asking if it's available on the website. And thank you again, Dr. Cox. We really, really appreciate it. It was a phenomenal presentation.
Oh, well,